Garfield is in a room. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle in John Arbuckle's drawing studio. John Arbuckle says, "Hi there, I'm John Arbuckle. I'm a cartoonist, and this is my cat, Garfield." Garfield thinks to himself, "Hi there, I'm Garfield. I'm a cat, and this is my cartoonist, John." John says, "Our only thought is to entertain you." Garfield thinks to himself, "Feed me." Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John Arbuckle says, "Happy birthday, Garfield. I have a surprise for you. A rubber mousey." He proceeds to pull a mouse out of his pocket. Garfield thinks to himself, could have used a little salt, as he is chewing the rubber mousey. Garfield is in a room. A mouse runs by Garfield. There is a couch in this room. Garfield looks unimpressed. John Arbuckle screams, "A mouse, get it." "Garfield, you didn't even try." Garfield thinks to himself, show me a good mouser, and I'll show you a cat with bad breath. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle as John Arbuckle is eating a steak. John Arbuckle hands Garfield a plate of food. John says, "I'm putting you on a diet, Garfield. Here's your dinner." Garfield looks scared and points to the opposite direction. John looks and says, "What?" John looks towards the reader as Garfield is chewing on John's steak with a smile. Garfield is in a room. He is sitting on top of a television. He is looking snug. Garfield thinks to himself, happiness is a warm television set. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. He slaps away a piece of food, proceeds to jump on it, and looks at it. John Arbuckle says, "Don't be cruel, Garfield. Put the cat burger out of its misery and eat it." Garfield is in a room. He is laying in his little cat box. Garfield thinks to himself, cats. We cats are intelligent, soft, cute. Garfield is now walking out of his cat box. Furry, cuddly, playful. Garfield is now scratching the curtains. Demure. Garfield is now in a room with John Arbuckle as John Arbuckle rests in his bed. Garfield now starts to strangle John Arbuckle awake. Garfield thinks to himself, and masters of the house, as John Arbuckle puts food in Garfield's dish. Garfield is in a room. He is sitting on top of a cabinet that is filled with books, china, a flower pot, and a picture. Garfield thinks to himself, we cats like to sit in high places. It reinforces our superiority. Garfield looks down. He looks towards the reader and says, help. Garfield is in a room. He is standing precariously on a table, and on the other side of the table is there's a space, and on the other table is a ham. Garfield is licking his lips. He tries reaching for it, and then he falls, and he grabs the other table and thinks to himself, Garfield, you dummy, as he hangs precariously. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle as John Arbuckle holds what appears to be a hot dog over Garfield's head. John is sitting. He is wearing shorts and a white t-shirt. John Arbuckle says, here, Garfield. Bag. Garfield then swipes at John Arbuckle's leg as John screams, youch, and drops the hot dog. Garfield is now eating the hot dog and thinks to himself, groveling is not one of my strong suits. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John is drinking coffee and pulls a coffee cup away from Garfield. Garfield looks unimpressed. John says, you can't drink coffee, Garfield. You'll stunt your... Garfield looks at John, and John looks towards the reader. 1 lump or 2, John says, as he gives the coffee cup back and puts a cube of sugar in. Garfield is in a room. He is using a toothpick to clean his teeth as he is near his Garfield-named food bowl. Garfield thinks to himself, all I ever do is eat and sleep, eat and sleep, eat and sleep. There must be more to a cat's life than that, but I hope not. Garfield is in a room. He is sitting on John's lap as John is holding not 1 but 2 bottles of an unknown substance. It could be beer, it could be pop. On his lap is also a bowl of popcorn. John says, this is it, Garfield, the late movie with Brigitte Bardot. Got our soda pop, got our popcorn, we're set. John Arbuckle and Garfield in the last panel are now asleep. Garfield is in a room. He is in his sleeping box. He's thinking to himself, I am out of shape. I think I'll take up jogging. Garfield then jumps out of his box, takes a leap, starts panting heavily, and is now at his food dish, thinking to himself, woo, I made it. Despite the fact that his bed, his little cat box, is honestly not that far away from his food bowl. Garfield is in a room. He's going up to an unknown person's set of legs. He's looking happy. He goes up to those set of legs and starts to rub himself against them and purring. The last panel has Garfield looking all sorts of messed up. His hair is all over the place. And Garfield thinks to himself, I hate static electricity. Garfield is in a room looking at a fishbowl with a fish in it. Garfield thinks to himself, I really shouldn't eat that fish. Garfield looks towards the reader and then proceeds to put his arm into the fishbowl and thinks to himself, call it an ethnic weakness. Garfield is in a room. He is scratching himself. Itch. He has an itch and he's trying to scratch it. He keeps scratching, but he does not get closer to the itch. He starts to scream, arg, as it startles John Arbuckle. Garfield is in a room with his dog dish, more like a cat dish, of food. He sniffs, thinks to himself, cat food. The bouquet leaves something to be desired and walks away. Garfield is in a room. He is scratching the curtains and thinks to himself, a curtain upon which to sharpen my claws. He gets stuck. He is trying to struggle. He struggles away, but then gives up and thinks to himself, I hate double knit. Garfield is in a room. He is currently reading a letter. The letter reads, Dear Garfield, believe it or not, I'm an ugly kitten. Oh, I do all the things cute kittens do, play with yarn and such, but I don't get any attention. What can I do? Mud fence. Dear Mud, Garfield thinks to himself as he looks towards the reader, you're trying too hard to be cute. You'll get more attention if you just be yourself and sharpen your claws on the living room drapes. Garfield is in a room. He is once again on top of the precarious cabinet in the kitchen, and he is staring at the table, which has a steak on it. Garfield thinks to himself, steak. He jumps, screams bonsai, poomp. He lands on the steak, and he now has the steak in his mouth. Off screen, John Arbuckle screams, Garfield! Garfield starts hissing as John tries to approach Garfield with the steak in his mouth. Garfield thinks to himself, even a house cat has to forage for himself once in a while. Garfield is in a room. He is on the sofa. He thinks to himself, a new sofa. He proceeds to jump on the sofa. The sofa is now destroyed, and Garfield thinks to himself, much better. Garfield is in a room. He is thinking to himself, I'm getting lazy. It would do me good to get some exercise. Garfield yawns and stretches and thinks to himself, much better, as he goes to sleep. Garfield is no longer in a room. He is outside. He is at a barbecue, and on the barbecue appears to be some burgers. Garfield is trying to reach for the burgers on a lawn chair, and Garfield thinks to himself, love a cookout. He tries reaching, but he keeps missing. Garfield is now in a room with John Arbuckle as John Arbuckle holds a spatula and looks at Garfield, who is now burnt and smoking. Garfield thinks to himself, mind if I smoke? Garfield is in a room. He thinks to himself, I'm going to take an active part in energy conservation. He proceeds to lay down frontwise and thinks to himself, get on your mark, get set. Then his back end goes down. And Garfield thinks to himself, conserve. Garfield is in a room. He is sitting on John's lap as John holds what we can now assume to be a soda pop bottle. They are watching television. John Arbuckle thinks to himself, you're going to love this movie, Garfield. It's my all-time favorite. Now, here's where Lieutenant Lacroix finds a spot of blood on the butler's sleeve. So he figures, aha, this guy is acting very suspicious. John Arbuckle is interrupted as Garfield shoves the bottle into John's mouth. Garfield is in a room. Garfield thinks to himself, I'm just your average ordinary cat. For instance, I'm crazy about nature's most perfect food. Garfield reaches off panel and pulls in what we can assume to be lasagna. Garfield thinks to himself, lasagna. Garfield is in a room. John Arbuckle is filling a tub with soap. John Arbuckle does not see Garfield. John Arbuckle says, Garfield, bath time. Garfield runs and hides behind John's chair. John walks by. Garfield. He walks by Garfield as Garfield is hidden behind the chair. Garfield runs past the other way where John was walking and almost runs into a table that is holding a flower vase. Garfield stops and thinks with a smirk. John Arbuckle is now in this room looking around for Garfield but cannot find him, as Garfield is now hidden in the flower vase. Garfield thinks to himself, you do what you have to. Garfield is in a room sitting in his little cat box, his little bed. He thinks to himself, this is the life. I don't think I'll ever get out of bed again. He curls up. Garfield thinks to himself, I'm hungry. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle as John Arbuckle is reading a newspaper. John says, good news, Garfield. The administration says the rate of inflation is going down. Garfield thinks to himself, that and $1.50 will get you a cup of coffee. Garfield is not in a room. He is outside. He is laying in the bushes and thinks to himself, here comes the mailman. A set of legs that we can only assume to be the mailman is now at the front door of John Arbuckle's house as Garfield leaps with his claws out and his teeth out. Garfield is now sitting in front of the house with a tattered rag in his mouth, thinking to himself, why should dogs have all the fun? Garfield is in a room and thinking to himself, oh boy, today is Thursday and that's lasagna day. A hand reaches out and that hand holds a cat food bowl with cat food. Garfield thinks to himself, cat food? The last panel shows John walking away, getting a cat food bowl filled with cat food thrown at the back of his head. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle as John Arbuckle is sitting. Garfield is on a pillow and John Arbuckle is tickling Garfield. John says, tickle, tickle. He keeps tickling. Garfield is now on his back. As he keeps tickling, John starts screaming, tickle, tickle, tickle. And Garfield, laying down, covered in sweat, says, I think I'm going to throw up. Thinks. Garfield thinks. Garfield is in a room. He stretches and yawns. He then proceeds to stretch his back and he hears a crick. Garfield is now in that position, that same outstretched position in John's arms. John has picked up the phone and is saying, hello, doctor, my cat's stuck in a stretch. I don't know where Garfield is. He is in a space. There is a dog. Garfield is chasing a dog. He proceeds to hide in the bushes. He jumps out and attacks the mailman as John Arbuckle looks lostlessly. He's just staring, listless, towards the mailman. Garfield then proceeds to jump out of the house. Garfield is now in a room eating the mail. Garfield is now outside chasing a car. Garfield is now outside attacking a mailman as John sticks his head out. We are now outside of John Arbuckle's house with a sign that says, beware of cat. Garfield is in a room. He is eating something as well as holding a chicken drumstick in his hand. Garfield is slurping, munching, smacking. John Arbuckle says, Garfield, you're a fat, lazy, arrogant pig. Apologies, I misread that. John Arbuckle says, Garfield, you're a fat, arrogant, lazy pig. He proceeds to poke Garfield in the stomach. Garfield looks shocked and thinks to himself, well, excuse me. Garfield is in a room. He's going towards a wall. He begins to climb the wall with his claws outstretched. Garfield is now on a roof as John Arbuckle is watching television. John Arbuckle says, Garfield, cut that out. Garfield is in a room. He is eating what appears to be a grapefruit. He puts a spoon into the grapefruit and it squirts juice in his face. Garfield, angry, starts to slam the grapefruit with his spoon. Chunk, 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 chunk. He looks angry. He is now punching the fruit as John Arbuckle comes into frame and says, Garfield, you should really learn to control your temper. John Arbuckle is in a room. He is reading a newspaper. This is 1978, so he's probably reading about the new directed film by Woody Allen. He is reading this and he reaches towards the side table on his chair, yet he does not find anything. He looks towards the reader and thinks to himself, now where could my pipe be? The last frame has Garfield smoking a pipe as off-screen John Arbuckle screams, Garfield! Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. This is a continuation of the previous comic. John pulls the pipe out of Garfield's mouth, is about to smoke it, stops and looks towards the reader, and puts the pipe back into Garfield's mouth. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. Garfield is watching television while wearing mouse ears. On the television, it says MIC as John Arbuckle chuckles. Heh, heh, heh. John looks towards the reader and says, a cat who likes Mickey Mouse, as the television continues, KEY. And Garfield thinks to himself, shake it, Annette, as he continues to watch the television. Garfield is in a room. He is scratching himself. He continues to scratch himself. He continues to scratch himself. He continues to scratch himself. Garfield now looks really adorable after scratching himself. It cuts. The last panel shows John Arbuckle at the table eating what appears to be a steak. John looks towards this cute Garfield and says, don't try looking cute at me, Garfield. You still can't have any of my steak. Garfield is no longer in a room. He is outside, hiding behind a bush as what appears to be either a mailman or a Boy Scout walks by. Garfield thinks to himself, Girl Scouts like me. He hops out, going ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. He is spinning wildly as the Girl Scout drops her cookies. Garfield thinks to himself, I amuse them, as the Girl Scout runs away. Garfield is in a room. He is scratching the couch. My apologies, it's not a couch, it's a chair. Garfield thinks to himself, oops, I got a scratch on John's favorite chair. Maybe he won't notice. As Garfield walks away, the chair has been destroyed on one side from Garfield's scratching. Garfield is in a room. He is holding what appears to be a jar of what might have an olive at the bottom. Garfield thinks to himself, one last olive. He reaches. He tries to reach with his tongue out. The last panel, Garfield is now in a room with John Arbuckle as John looks, and there's a clunk, clunk, clunk as Garfield's arm got stuck in the jar. Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle who is in the bathroom. John Arbuckle is shaving his face, wearing his underwear. He is shaving. All of a sudden, there's a sound of sss. John Arbuckle looks over, scared, confused. Next to John Arbuckle is Garfield covered in shaving cream. John laughs as Garfield thinks to himself, one word about curiosity killing the cat, and I'll break your face. Garfield is in a room. He's sitting down watching TV. Garfield thinks to himself, I hate television commercials. They're too long to sit through, and they're too short for a trip to the sandbox. Garfield is in a room. There's a fish bowl and a fish in the fish bowl. Garfield is reaching in, and he looks quickly to his left, or to his right. Behind him is John Arbuckle walking into frame. John looks unimpressed as he's walking by. Garfield looks amused, pretending that he was not, in fact, trying to get the fish. John looks towards the reader and thinks to himself, never trust a smiling cat. Garfield is outside, but he is stuck on the screen door. His claws are extended. Garfield thinks to himself, nothing to do today but hang on the screen door. Garfield looks towards the reader and thinks, I'm bored. Bored, 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 bored. Bored, 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 bored. Bored, 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 bored. I wish something could happen. John Arbuckle flings the door open, slamming Garfield into the house. As John screams, Garfield, lunchtime. Slam. Garfield thinks to himself, I'm in pain. Pain, 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 pain. Garfield is in a room. He hears ding dong. A new character enters the fray. John says, Lyman. Lyman says, John. Lyman proceeds to grab John Arbuckle's shoulder, screaming, "I'm cold, I'm hungry, I'm weak, take me in." John says, "Sure, Lyman, you know my home is your home." Garfield thinks to himself, "And my sandbox is off limits." Garfield is in a room with John and Lyman. John says, "Is that all you have, the one suitcase?" Lyman says, "Well, not exactly." "Here, boy." Enters a dog. Garfield goes into the corner and thinks to himself, "Oh, Losey, Losey, Losey." Garfield is in a room laying down. He thinks to himself, "Come on, Garfield, snap out of this deep blue funk. So what if a dog moved in? You can handle it. Cheer up." The dog bounces by. Garfield looks to the heavens and screams, "Take me, Lord," in his mind. Garfield is in a room. He is next to Lyman, and John is next to a dog. John says, "What's your dog's name?" Lyman says, "Odie." Garfield thinks to himself, "Odie, a dog named Odie, a blimp named Hindenburg, a ship named Titanic, a car named Edsel," as he walks away. Garfield is in a room with Odie. Odie is hopping on what appears to be a table. He is hopping towards the edge. He jumps off. Crash. Garfield thinks to himself, 10 billion dogs in this world, and I get Tweedledee, the Wonder Dummy. Garfield is in a room with Odie. Garfield is looking at Odie as Odie woofs. Garfield proceeds to scream, bark. Odie runs away, yipping. Yip, 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 as Garfield looks smugly towards the reader. Garfield is in a room. He is laying down, thinking, "Poor me. Sigh, a vicious brute of a dog has moved into my home." Odie hops by, looking dopey. Garfield grabs Odie by the throat. Garfield begins hitting Odie. Whap, 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 whap. Garfield proceeds to dribble Odie like a basketball. Dribble, dribble, dribble. Garfield proceeds to punt Odie, kicking him off screen, or off frame. Garfield thinks to himself, "How will I ever survive?" Garfield is in a room with John and Lyman. Lyman is holding Garfield's back and says, "Does it hurt to rub a cat the wrong way?" John says, "I don't know." Suddenly a tussle occurs, with Lyman getting attacked by Garfield. Lyman and John are in a room, as Lyman is now injured. His clothes are in tatters, his mustache is ruined, and his hair is a complete mess. Lyman says, "Yep." Garfield is in a room with Lyman and Odie. Lyman is yelling at Odie, screaming, "Odie, look what you did on the floor." Lyman proceeds to grab Odie by the throat, hitting Odie with a newspaper on the butt as he screams, "No, no, 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 no." Garfield thinks to himself, they should have named him Spot. Garfield is not in a room. It is John and Lyman. John says, "Lyman, you got to housebreak Odie." Lyman asks, "How?" John says, "Swat him with something." Lyman asks, "With what?" Garfield enters the frame holding a baseball bat. Garfield is in a room with Odie. He has Odie by the throat and is looking like he's ready to punch him. John walks by and then he proceeds to pat Odie aggressively. John looks unimpressed. Garfield is in a room with Odie. Garfield is holding a bone and thinks to himself, "I think I'll put that dog's lights out." As he's about to swing, an unknown figure enters, just the legs. As John Arbuckle looks at Garfield, Garfield begins to scratch his back with the bone that he was about to hit Odie with. Garfield is in a room with Odie. This is a continuation of the previous comic as he is ready to hit Odie. He swings. Thock. Out of the way. Odie jumps. In turn, Garfield hits his foot. He proceeds to hop around. He is now hopping past Lyman and John as Lyman says, "New dance?" John says, "Bad aim." Garfield is in a room. He is laying down, thinking to himself, we cats are the source of many myths. The saying, nervous as a cat, is an old wives' tale. Odie sneaks up behind Garfield and barks, causing Garfield to jump up really high in the air. Odie looks up. Nothing. Odie continues to look up. Nothing. Odie proceeds to run away. Garfield then lands. thinks to himself. Not to mention, a cat always lands on his feet. Garfield lands on his head. Garfield is in a bathroom. He is drinking from what appears to be the sink in what I can only assume to be John's master bedroom bathroom. John says, as Garfield splashes around. Cats just love to play with water, John says. Garfield, in his hand is a watch, thinks to himself, woo, I never thought I'd find John's watch. Pardon me, woo, I thought I'd never find John's watch, as he is holding John's watch in the sink. Garfield is in a room. He is holding what appears to be a bowl. He is dabbing it with his fingers. Dab, dab, dab. He proceeds to splash, 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 causing a mess. John Arbuckle enters the frame and screams, my chicken soup. Garfield thinks to himself, the devil made me do it. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle as Lyman enters. Lyman is wearing what appears to be a Saturday Night Fever John Travolta white suit. John says, hey, John. Lyman says, hey, John, what do you think of my new outfit? Garfield proceeds to walk by it, causing a bunch of hair on his legs. Lyman says, does Garfield always shed like that? And John says, only on white disco suits. Garfield is in a room with Odie. He has his food bowl that is labeled Garfield. Odie has his food bowl that's labeled Odie. Odie is eating. Munch, munch, munch. Garfield kicks Odie. Punt. Garfield is now eating Odie's food bowl and says, gotta keep my strength up. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle getting pet by John. John is petting towards Garfield's tail, causing it to wag. He sort of scrunches up. Garfield is now walking away, scrunched up. Garfield is in a room. He is walking towards what appears to be either his bed or lasagna. He jumps in. Splooch! John says, help yourself to lasagna, Garfield, as John is eating what appears to be peas and potatoes. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John is sitting, wearing shorts and a white shirt. He is petting Garfield, pointing at Garfield's stomach. You're getting a little chunky there, pal. I'm thinking of putting you on a diet. Garfield looks alarmed and thinks, diet? I'm already feeling weak. Garfield is now strangling John, shaking it, screaming, food, I need food. The room's growing dim. Garfield falls down. John Arbuckle claps. Clap, 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 clap. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John Arbuckle says, Garfield, as of this minute, I'm putting you on a diet. Garfield looks shocked, confused. He has a 1,000-yard stare as John has a look of concern on his own face. John asks, Garfield? He looks towards the reader. I think I snapped his mind. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. Garfield looks melancholy. John says, come on, old buddy. Going on a diet's not all that bad. Why, a couple of pounds off the middle and you'll be fit and trim again. Garfield looks happy. John pets Garfield and says, that's better. John thinks to himself, I didn't have the heart to tell him. He's made the Weight Watchers 10 most wanted list. Garfield is in a room. He is walking, thinking to himself, so I'm on a diet. Big deal. You know what a diet is, don't you? It's die with a T. That's what it is. Garfield is in a room. He is walking by a vase and pushes it over. John has me on a diet. He proceeds to kick Odie with a poomp. Garfield continues walking. When the lasagna content in my blood gets low, I get mean. Garfield is in a room. He is near a bowl of fruit. He is reaching. He grabs what appears to be an apple and says, wax. Everything tastes good when you're on a diet, as the food bowl that was made up of waxed fruits has now been eaten. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John says, let's see how well you've done on your diet this week, Garfield. Now, where's that bathroom scale? Garfield cuts to Garfield, sitting in the last panel. I'm sitting on it, as the scale is underneath Garfield. Garfield is in a room. He is laying down. He is sweating. Garfield thinks to himself, I hate summer. I got to beat this heat somehow. John's fan. He grabs John's fan. John's sunglasses. He grabs John's glasses. John's hat. Garfield is now in John's room taking stuff. He proceeds to he goes towards the kitchen, into the refrigerator, and grabs from the freezer some ice cubes. Garfield thinks to himself, some ice cubes in John's old kiddie pool. Garfield is now outside with John's fan blowing towards him. He is in his little kiddie pool, covered in ice, wearing John's glasses and John's hat. The mailman comes up and says, Morning, John. Here's your mail, as he mistakenly hands Garfield the mail. John sticks his head out, looking confused. Garfield is not in a room. He is outside. He is laying down against a tree. Garfield thinks, Labor Day, Schmaber Day. What a dumb day. To hire some jerk, then send him away. To celebrate work by playing all day. Garfield is not in a room. This is John Arbuckle. John is putting on a glove. He is now putting on a helmet. He is now wearing armor. He grabs Garfield and puts him in a bath as Garfield flails. Garfield is in a room. The bath has just finished as John takes him out. John proceeds to wipe Garfield down with a towel. As he pulls the towel away, Garfield, through the power of static electricity, is now hair all sticking up, looking like a poof ball. John looks concerned. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle as John is about to eat a steak. Garfield is wagging his tail. John is going, hee 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 hee. Now he is laughing. John is laughing. He says, ha 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 ha, as Garfield continues to wag his tail. John looks down. The steak is no longer there. Garfield is in a room. He is in John's bedroom. John is ready to be turning off the light. He has a radio next to his bedside table, or he has a radio on his bedside table. The radio says, and that's all for Mystery Theater. Good night. John turns the light off. Click. All we see are John's eyes and Garfield's eyes. Garfield looks menacing. John proceeds to turn the light back on, screaming, Garfield, cut that out. As he turns the light back on. Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle and Lyman. John says, what are you doing tonight, Lyman? Lyman says, I'm going to catch that new flick down at the Bijou. It's about this kid who puts a tack in his teacher's chair and she sits on it. John says, not much of a plot. Lyman says, I suppose not, but I still enjoy the movies where the boy gets the girl in the end. Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle. He is waking up. He turns his alarm clock off that has been ringing. John Arbuckle is now putting a shirt on. He is wearing sweats and a shirt. John Arbuckle walks by Lyman saying, Morning, Lyman. Lyman says, Good morning, John, as Lyman is also putting on his clothing. Ready to go? Be right with you. John is walking off frame as Lyman stands with Odie. Garfield! Garfield, John exclaims as Garfield sleeps. Rise and shine, old buddy. Time to go jogging, as John proceeds to pat Garfield awake. Lyman says, Where's Garfield? John enters the frame, covered in wounds. He has been beat up badly. His one shoe is missing, and his sweats have been ripped up. His shirt is in tatters. Lyman asks, Where's Garfield? John says, I think I'll let him sleep in. What we can only assume to be Garfield is sleeping in his little cat box bed. He jumps up, but we can't tell because he is covered in his blanket. He runs, covered in his blanket. Garfield thinks to himself in curse words, leg cramps. There's a star, an @ sign, and lightning bolt, a cloud, and a couple of exclamation marks. Leg cramps. As Garfield gets out of the blanket. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle as John is looking at the back of the TV holding what appears to be 2 fuses. John thinks to himself, Garfield smacks the television. Startling John, the TV starts working. There is a singer singing. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John is eating. Garfield begins to purr. John is eating. He purrs louder, startling John. John then proceeds to hand Garfield what he was eating. John says, Have some lasagna, Garfield, as the purr goes back to normal. John is in a room in front of his drawing desk. He hears a crinkle, rustle, crinkle as Garfield jumps up. John looks into his trash can and says, Garfield, get out of the trash. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John is eating as a fly buzzes by John's head. John is eating what appears to be a piece of bread, potatoes, and what we can only assume to be some sort of meat. The fly buzzes by as Garfield thinks, darn bugs. Garfield swats John in the back of the head, causing John to slam his face into the plate. John says, thanks, I needed that, really angrily towards Garfield. Garfield is not in a room. It is John and Lyman. John says, cats make better pets. Lyman says, but you need a dog for protection. Cut to Garfield chasing Odie. Lyman is crying as John thinks to himself, I hate to see a grown man cry. Garfield is in a room. He is being grabbed by two hands. He is now being grabbed and trying to protect himself as John walks out. He is fighting. He does not want to go into the car. John is pushing him into the car. John slams the door. Garfield is now in a car with John Arbuckle as John is driving. John is driving. He opens the door and Garfield runs out. Garfield runs away past the veterinary clinic. John thinks to himself, somehow, they always know. Garfield is in a room. He is playing with the blinds on his window. His finger gets stuck as it pulls up. Flip, 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 flip. Garfield is now stuck in the blind, thinking, I hate Mondays. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John has a puppet on his hand, and John says, hey, Garfield, meet Hondo the puppet. Garfield looks unimpressed as John proceeds to go, hi, Garfield, you're sure fat, ha, 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 with the puppet. Garfield walks away as he has decimated the puppet. The puppet is no longer there. John's hand is smoke. The puppet is not there anymore. John looks confused. Garfield is in a room. He is not in a room. Garfield is not in a room. He is outside. He is sweating. Garfield thinks to himself, I hate summer. The sun is beating down. The unbearable heat, sticky car seats, hay fever season, and scorched lawns, not to mention curdled kitty munchies. Garfield is once again laying outside. He is laying down, smiling. He is sleeping. The sun is beating down on his stomach. He looks down, snorts, thinks to himself, uh-oh. Garfield has a sunburn on his belly as he walks by John inside. John is sitting on a couch, going, ow, ow, eep, ip, ow, ah, ooch, ooch. Garfield is not in a room. It is just John and Lyman. Lyman looks quickly to his right. Garfield starts coming by, still jumping, feeling the pain from the sunburn. Lyman looks confused. John explains, sunburned tummy. Garfield is in a room, sitting on John's lap, on John's favorite chair as they are watching television. John says, oh boy, at last, college football season. I would have played college football had it not been for my beliefs. I don't believe in bleeding on Saturday. Garfield thinks to himself, how would you like to be unnecessarily roughed? Garfield is in a room. He is laying down. He thinks to himself, I hate dogs. Odie hops by. Garfield thinks, look at that poor mutt. All buggy-eyed, panty, and slobbery. It's just disgusting. He continues to pant. Lyman is now in the room, laughing. He proceeds to pet Odie on the head and says, here, Odie, have a steak. He pulls a steak out of his back pocket and gives it to Odie. Garfield looks unimpressed. However, he proceeds to pant, running up towards John as John is eating a steak. Garfield is not in a room. It's John Arbuckle. John appears to be making his bed. Whip, he whistles as he gets the sheets ready. He fluffs the pillow. John screams, Garfield, time to eat. Garfield is actually in the bed. John made the bed with Garfield in it as Garfield is now covered in sheets. And Garfield thinks to himself, I hate Mondays. Garfield is in a room with Odie. He is sitting on John's favorite chair as he sees Odie jump by. Garfield thinks to himself, all dogs should be banned from our country. They are noisy, silly, sloppy, rude, and they're rusting our nation's fire hydrants. Garfield is in a room. He is sneaking up to Odie, thinking to himself, tum-dee-dum-dee-dum. Garfield then kicks Odie. Punt. He walks away. If it weren't for my naturally sweet nature, I'd make life rough for that dog. Garfield is in a room. He is hiding underneath John's table as John is eating a sandwich. Odie looks confused. Garfield sticks his head out and goes, bleh. Odie barks. Garfield, in terror, jumps away, causing the table to slam against the wall with John Arbuckle horrifically stuck underneath it. Garfield thinks to himself, I hate to see that sucker's bite. Garfield is in a room eating his food from his labeled food dish. Odie is sneaking up behind him and barks, causing Garfield to slam his face into his food dish. Garfield thinks to himself, if God had intended for dogs to bark, he would have given them roots and leaves. Garfield is not in a room, but it is John Arbuckle. John Arbuckle is eating a sandwich. Odie suddenly gets kicked. Biff! He flies in the air. Bop! Garfield is now flying in the air as John continues to eat a sandwich. Smack! Poke! The animals are fighting underneath the table. As John Arbuckle says, Garfield won, Odie won. Garfield is in a room. Correction. Garfield is not in a room. He is outside. He is sitting on a fence as he goes, ahem. Me. Meow. He screams. An old man we have not been introduced to yet, wakes up, blinking, confused. He goes up to his window, screaming, shut up, you stupid cat. In his hand is a flower pot filled with flowers. He throws it through the window. Garfield grabs the flower with a thwack and throws it back, hitting the old man in the back of the head with a chunk. Garfield thinks to himself, Tom Seaver, eat your heart out. Garfield is in a room. He jumps out. He's jumping towards the window. He boings. He jumps over. But then he jumps out right in towards John Arbuckle's lawnmower. Garfield gets run over. He is now covered in his back has been shaved. And Garfield thinks to himself, I hate Mondays. Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle and Lyman. John says, I wonder if I should pick up anything for Garfield from the pet store. Lyman suggests, how about a scratching post? John says, that's a good idea. I'll get him one. Lyman grabs and hugs John Arbuckle, says, bless you, as Garfield is scratching Lyman's leg. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John has finally got the scratching post and says, surprise, Garfield. Garfield thinks to himself, oh boy, a scratching post. He proceeds to fling the little mouse that was on top of the scratching post and proceeds to scratch it. Scratch, 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 scratch. Garfield walks away. The scratching post has been destroyed and thinks to himself, it wasn't the living room drapes, but I'll give it a 7. Garfield is in a room. He is sleeping in his cat bed box. He yawns. Garfield thinks to himself, that floor sure looks cold this morning. Better not risk it, as he goes back under his covers. Garfield is in a room. He is once again in his kitten box, his little bed. He thinks to himself, I'm not getting out of the bed if the floor is cold. He proceeds to poke the floor and thinks, it's freezing. Good. As he goes back into his covers. We can only assume Garfield is in a room and that he is underneath his sheets. As Odie jumps in, Garfield rests. Odie barks, causing Garfield to jump out of his bed. He lands back down and thinks, now that I'm up, I might as well have breakfast. Garfield is in a room. Once again, he's still in his bed. John enters the frame and says, good morning, Garfield. Today we're going to learn to walk on a leash, as he puts a leash around Garfield's neck. John tries pulling Garfield out. He tries to pull. Garfield suddenly runs ahead, causing John to fall out and slam his head on his steps. Garfield is now being grabbed by John as Garfield is screaming, "Rawr!" John is now walking. He has been scratched. His shoe is missing. His shirt is in tatters. His shirt and pants are in tatters. His hair is a mess as Garfield continues to jump, screaming. An old couple are sitting by The old couple say, I tell you, Thelma, this neighborhood is getting weirder by the minute. Garfield is in a room as a buzz of a fly flies by. He jumps, sploosh. He lands in the toilet and thinks to himself, I hate Mondays. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. We only see Garfield's tail as John is at the table drinking coffee. The tail is heading towards John. Suddenly John startles. John says, ever thought of walking around the furniture? Garfield is in a room with Odie as Odie runs by, knocking Garfield down. Garfield thinks to himself, oh well, I guess a cat is entitled to let down on his defenses once in his life, as Odie runs by and hits Garfield again. Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle as he is watering his plants, what appears to be a cactus. John proceeds to pet the cactus as Garfield jumps out of the other plant, and John thinks to himself, what's the use? Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle. John says, Garfield, I'm back from the store. We're having a cookout tonight. I got steak and corn, and Garfield is now in John's shopping bag, eating. John says, and you just ate the briquettes. Garfield is not in a room. It is John sitting in a chair. He sits. Garfield comes up looking adorable. Garfield is now on John's lap as John thinks to himself, cats are nice to have when you're feeling lonely. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John looks quickly to his left. Garfield looks shocked. Eyes are wide. Both eyes are wide. They are staring at each other. 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 John blinks. He proceeds to cry as Garfield thinks to himself, I win again. Garfield's in a room with John Arbuckle. John is looking happy. Garfield is looking happy. Garfield is walking now on John. He is climbing up John, looking happy as John looks startled. John thinks to himself, I think I'll have Garfield declawed. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John says, Garfield, I'm going to have you declawed. Garfield thinks to himself, take an arm, take a leg, but spare my claws. Garfield is no longer in frame as John says, you're going to be declawed and that's that. Now get your head out of the oven. Garfield is now in a room. He is at the oven. He thinks to himself, I couldn't face life as a declawed person, so I'll just stick my head in this oven and end it all. Garfield's head is now in the oven. He thinks to himself, stupid electric stove. Garfield is in his bed. He is covered. He thinks to himself, John's going to have me declawed. What a frightening thought. He gets snug and thinks, going through life unarmed? Garfield is not in a room. It is John and Lyman. Both are holding coffee cups. John says, I took Garfield to the vet to be declawed. They're removing his stitches next Thursday. Lyman says, poor Garfield. John says, who's talking about Garfield? Garfield is in a room with John. He is sitting on John's lap as John says, I'm sorry I tried to have you declawed, Garfield. I love you just the way you are, claws and all. Garfield thinks to himself, someday, somehow, when you're least expecting it, I'm going to shred your bedroom suite. Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle. He is hiding behind a pot filled with plants. He sticks his head through the flowers, saying, oh, Garfield. Aha. Garfield is hiding behind John's favorite chair. John is running. Garfield is running. John jumps, catches him, screams, gotcha. Garfield is now putting up a fight, attacking John. John is trying to pull Garfield away as Garfield continues to run by. John says, Garfield, come back here and take your vitamin pill. Garfield is in a room. He is on a cab. He's near a bedroom set of drawers. He pulls the bottom drawer out and inside is a teddy bear. He thinks, hello, what's this? A teddy bear. A dumb, stupid, silly looking old teddy bear. I think I'll call him Pookie. Garfield is now walking with Pookie in his mouth, walking by John's chair. John is reading the newspaper, looking smiley. He suddenly looks shocked, thinking, I didn't see that. I didn't see that. I didn't see that. I didn't see that. Garfield is in a room, holding Pookie as John is eating dinner. John is eating what appears to be peas and potatoes. He puts the bear up, and John turns to the right and says, "Get away from my food, bear." John thinks to himself, "I just yelled at a teddy bear." Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle, once again holding Pookie. John Arbuckle says, "No, Garfield, I will not kiss your teddy bear goodnight." Garfield proceeds to grab John by the collar. John kisses the teddy bear. Garfield is not in a room. It is John laying in the bathtub, thinking to himself, nothing like a hot bath after a chilly day. Garfield's head pops up as John screams, "Garfield!" Garfield grabs Pookie, thinking to himself, "Want to warm up, Pookie?" Garfield is not in a room. It is John. He is outside grabbing his mail, thinks to himself, "Oh boy, my Bachelor magazine. I wonder who the centerfold is. Elkie? Farah? Elmira the Amazon?" As he is unfolding it, the fold is long. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 folds. So it is on the floor. Garfield is in a room. It is scary outside. There's a tree and a full moon. Garfield thinks to himself, it's that time of year again. At Halloween, we cats become bewitched. Our eyes turn blood red, our fangs grow, and our hair stands up, not to mention longer claws. Garfield is now looking like an horrific creature. His hair is all white, his claws are out. He looks towards the mirror and screams. John Arbuckle is in a room with a vet as Garfield is passed out. John says, "That's right, Doc." He screamed, turned white, and passed out. Garfield is outside, hiding in the bushes, thinking to himself, here comes the mailman. Drat. The mailman is wearing knight's armor. Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle and Odie as Odie barks. John Arbuckle is shocked and looks towards Odie, saying, "Odie, cut that out." At the same time, Garfield is there and grabs a steak. Garfield has now split the steak with Odie, thinking to himself, "Stick with me, kid. We'll go places." Garfield is in a room. He is outside, staring out the window, thinking to himself, "I hate November. Lifeless trees, bleak afternoon, raw winds, icy sandboxes." Garfield is jumping by his food dish. Kaboing, kaboing, kaboing. He is jumping closer to it. Kaboing, kaboing, kaboing. He then jumps into his food, knocking his food all over the place, thinking, food's fun. Garfield is not in a room. It is Lyman. Lyman is running into frame towards John. Lyman screes to a stop. Lyman says, "4-ply steel-belted radial retread tenny pumps," and then runs by John Arbuckle. Garfield is in a room. He is behind the TV. He has the TV carpet in his hand as Odie is in front of the TV. Garfield pulls the TV, or pulls the rug, causing the TV to fly and land on top of him. Garfield thinks to himself, "That hurt me more than it did him." Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle. John Arbuckle is in front of a door screaming, "Garfield!" Garfield is walking towards the outside, thinks to himself, a little nippy outside today, but I gotta get some exercise. Garfield steps outside and thinks, well, I can wait. The door slams shut. Oh no, the door is not shut. The door is open. He goes back in. I can wait. But then thinks to himself, might as well get it over with. And then again, Garfield stops moving. John Arbuckle screams, "Make up your mind." Garfield is in a room. He is looking towards the reader and thinks to himself, some people have anxiety attacks, some people have gas attacks. I have nap attacks, and proceeds to sleep. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle as John is sitting in his favorite chair. He thinks to himself, nap attack, and falls asleep. John thinks to himself, I've heard of cat naps, but this is ridiculous. Garfield is in a room. He thinks to himself, nap attack, and falls backwards off of a table. Garfield thinks to himself, whoever thought a nap attack could hurt? As he is on the floor. Garfield is in a room as John is eating his peas and potatoes. Garfield has his food dish as Garfield reaches and says, "My tuna pate could use some salt." Garfield is trying to reach for salt that's on the other side of John's table. Garfield is now on top of John's food. He's being like, "Oops, here comes another nap attack," and falls asleep in John's food. Garfield is asleep. John thinks to himself, "There you have it. Garfield's passion for food is only exceeded by his passion for sleep." Garfield is in a room. He is sleeping in his little cat bed. He thinks to himself, "Gee, I'd love to stay in bed all day, but I gotta eat sometime." He thinks to himself. He has an idea. There's a light bulb. Buzz, saw, scratch, scratch, cut, cut. Garfield is now walking. Garfield is now walking with his cat bed. His feet are sticking out underneath it as he goes towards his food. Garfield is still in his contraption. He thinks to himself, oh, I feel another nap attack coming on. Apologies. Oh, I feel a nap attack coming on. Garfield falls asleep. Thinks to himself, turtles have got it knocked, as his bed comes back and hits the floor. Garfield is in a room with Odie and John. John is eating food at the table. He is eating a piece of bread. He looks towards Odie and Garfield, who are looking longingly towards him. John says, "Why don't you boys go fight or something?" Off screen, someone says, "Hi, John." John says, "Hi, Lyman," as Odie and Garfield are still staring at John eating. "I'm starved. What's to eat?" John says, "Nothing. I'm eating the last of the food." Lyman proceeds to join Garfield and Odie as they stare at John eating. Garfield is in a room with John. John is asleep. Garfield's paws are ready as John is asleep, thinking zzz, snort, zzz. Garfield then proceeds to put his paws on John's face. John screams, "Arg!" as Garfield thinks to himself, sleeping people are fun. Garfield is in a room with John. John is cutting some lasagna and thinks to himself, says to himself, "I love lasagna." Garfield thinks to himself, "So do I," as he proceeds to eat the lasagna. Gobble, 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 gobble. John says, "I love cats. I wanted a cat, so what do? I go to the pet store and ask for a cat. What do they give me? A lasagna with fur and fangs." Garfield is in a room. He is walking. He thinks to himself, cats need a balanced diet. Meats, eggs, fruit, vegetables, bread. My apologies. Meat, eggs, fruit, bread, vegetables, and an occasional Boston fern for a dessert, as Garfield is in a fern eating it. Garfield is walking by John, by a chair, a rocking chair. Garfield thinks to himself, "Oh no, John got a rocking chair. As long as there is one rocking chair left in this world, no cat's tail is safe." John enters the frame. Garfield has destroyed the rocking chair as John screams, "My rocking chair!" Garfield thinks to himself, "You're kindling." Garfield is in a room. He's thinking to himself, let's see, the piano, bookshelves, bench, floor. Nope, I think I'll go with the chest, chair, hassock, floor. Garfield proceeds to jump off of the windowsill. Onto the chest, onto the chair, onto the hassock, and then onto the floor. Garfield is in a room. He is near two canisters with flowers on them. Garfield says, one canister is doggy biscuits and the other is kitty munchies, but I forget which is which. Garfield slams his paw onto the table, causing Odie to jump out of one of the canisters. Garfield opens up the other one. Garfield is in a room. He is with Odie. He is meowing. Odie is barking. They are roaring, fifting, barking. John enters the room and says, "Hold it down, you guys." They get quiet. Meow. Woof. They begin to get louder and louder and louder. John enters the room screaming, "One more sound out of you two and you're in big trouble." There's a ring. John goes and picks up the phone. "Hello?" There is more barking and roaring coming from the phone. Garfield is in bed. Garfield is in a room. He is laying in his bed, thinking to himself, 6 a.m. This is my favorite time of day for sleep, as he goes back into his kitty sheets. Garfield is in a room, jumping on a sleeping John Arbuckle, who is in his bed. Garfield proceeds to jump on John's head as John screams, Garfield. Garfield thinks to himself, he sure wakes up in a bad mood, doesn't he? Garfield is in a room. Garfield thinks to himself, I love scrambled eggs, especially on chilly mornings, when my feet get cold. Garfield's feet are in John's scrambled eggs as John looks shocked and enters the frame. Garfield is in a room. Garfield is thinking to himself, I'm basically your neat cat. He is near a pot of flowers. He proceeds to knock that down. Crash. I like to keep my windowsill tidy, he says to the reader. Garfield is in a room, thinking to himself, we cats are loners, with one possible exception. He walks up and climbs on John's face, smiling as John is eating. Garfield thinks to himself, we can be very social when it comes to food. Garfield is in a room with John. John is eating, and there's a pan of lasagna. John says, okay, Garfield, just one bite of lasagna, and that's it. Garfield proceeds to grab the pan and put it against his face. John thinks to himself, it's amazing how much that cat can store in his cheeks. As Garfield walks away, cheeks filled with lasagna. Garfield is in a room. He is about to grab a pie as John enters, screaming, aha! To be sure you stay away from my pie, I'm going to put this bell around your neck. Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. I should have thought of this long ago. As the bell continues to ding-a-ling, John grabs Garfield from the table with the pie and puts him on the ground. Garfield is in the bedroom now as he hears ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. He's going through the bathroom. Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. Now he's coming down the hall into the living room. Ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. John looks. Odie has the bell around his neck as Garfield is eating the pie. Garfield thinks to himself, no ding-a-ling's gonna keep me from my pie. Garfield is in a room. He is laying in his bed, his little cat bed. He goes, oh, doe, sniffs. He sniffs again. I think I have a code. He is looking rough, thinks to himself, look, even my thoughts are stuffed up. Garfield is in a room. He is walking, sniffing, hacking, coughing, wheezing. He proceeds to walk nicely by Odie, looking all prim and proper, before sniffing, hacking, coughing, and wheezing again. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John is drinking a cup of coffee as there is what appears to be a turkey. Garfield is hacking, sniffing, wheezing. He proceeds to go by the turkey and starts to eat it. Gobble, gobble, gobble. John looks scared as Garfield thinks to himself, or is it starve a cold, feed a fever? Garfield is in a room. He is about to sneeze. As John Arbuckle is reading his paper. In the bowl is some food. Garfield's bowl. There's food. Garfield sneezes. Wachoo. The bowl is now on John Arbuckle's head as John says, bless you. And Garfield sniffs. Garfield is in a room, sitting on John's lap. John is watching television in his favorite chair as Garfield begins to sneeze. He goes, wachoo. He sneezes so hard that it knocks John and his chair through the wall outside. John says, bless you. John Arbuckle, Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle and Lyman. John says, I think Garfield gave me a code. Sniff. Lyman asks, he what? John says, he gave me a code. Lyman says, pardon? John is screaming now, gave me a code, as Lyman laughs. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John is sleeping. John sleeps. Garfield burrs. Brr. John wakes up, yawning. Little does he realize that Garfield is actually hiding in his pajamas. John looks down. Garfield is now hiding behind on John's back. John pushes Garfield out of his pajamas. But Garfield goes back in. John is now moving, gesticulating wildly as Garfield is now in his leg, his pajama leg. John screams, "I know you're in there somewhere, Garfield. Out!" Garfield leads out of John's pajama leg, thinking, next time, I'll leave a wake-up call at the desk. Garfield is in a room with Lyman. Garfield is sitting on what appears to be some food. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle and Lyman. Garfield is sitting on some food. Lyman asks, "Do you know your cat's sitting on my meatloaf?" John says, "No, but if you hum a couple of bars, I'll fake it." Lyman says this is going to be a long week. Garfield is not in a room. It is just John Arbuckle. John says, "See you later, Garfield. I'm going to the grocery store." He stares. Garfield is now grabbing John's leg. "Very well. You may come along." Garfield is in a room with John. John is holding Garfield and says, "Now behave yourself in the grocery store, Garfield." Garfield jumps out, proceeds to be throwing cans and chicken and bottles in the air as John says, "I think I just turned a bull loose in a china shop." Garfield is in a room being carried by John as John is holding groceries in his left hand, and in his right arm is Garfield. John says, "That's the last time I take you to the grocery store, Garfield. I've never been so humiliated in all my life." Garfield thinks to himself, "So I ate the pastry section. Big deal." Garfield is in a room with Odie. Odie is in his food bowl. Odie is looking super excited as Garfield reaches towards Odie's food bowl. He grabs it. "Darn," Garfield thinks to himself. "That was too easy." Garfield is in a room. He is hiding around the corner as Odie sneaks up behind him. Garfield thinks to himself, when Odie comes by, I'm going to round off that pointy head of his. Odie sneaks up and licks Garfield. Garfield thinks to himself, how can you win against someone who doesn't even know the rules of the game? Garfield is not in a room. There's the house. It is snowing. It is windy. Lyman is putting on a jacket. Lyman is putting on a toque. Lyman screams, "Here, Odie." Odie comes by. Lyman is putting a leash around Odie's neck. John Arbuckle is smoking his pipe, sitting in his favorite chair, saying, "Isn't it a little cold to take Odie for a walk?" Lyman says, "Nonsense." Lyman enters with Odie. Odie is frozen. The leash is frozen over Lyman's back. John looks startled, smoking his pipe. Garfield is not in a room. John is writing a list of things to do. 1, wash car. 2, do laundry. Garfield walks by, shedding. John writes another third point. 3, and brush Garfield, as Garfield is shedding. Garfield is not in a room. John Arbuckle is looking towards the reader. In front of him is his potatoes, peas, and what appears to be another piece of food that I can't identify. He says, "I own a cat, and when you own a cat, eating a normal meal takes on an all-new perspective, knowing that somewhere in there is a cat hair with your name on it." Garfield is in a room. John Arbuckle is holding a brush, saying, "I'm going to brush all your loose hair out, Garfield." John proceeds to brush Garfield's hair. Brush, brush, brush. There's a big pile of hair, as John looks towards the reader and says, "I suspected as much." John is sweeping. Garfield is not in a room. John is sweeping. Sweep, 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 sweep. The hair is making a pile. Garfield is now in the room as John says, "Garfield, what am I supposed to do with all these cat hairs?" Garfield thinks to himself, "Make yourself another cat." John looks sad. "I have the distinct feeling that I was just zinged," he thinks to himself. Garfield is in a room with John. John gives Garfield a kiss in the back of the head. "Good night, Garfield." Smack. Hooey. His face is now covered in Garfield's hair. He walks by Lyman. Lyman asks, "Growing a beard?" John says, "I ate a milk dud and kissed a cat." Garfield is in a room. He is holding a note that says, "Dear Garfield, help. I have cat hairs all over my home. What can I do to keep Fluffy from shedding?" Garfield thinks, simple. Give the little beggar a good coat of varnish. Garfield is in a room. He is scratching John's favorite chair. Scratch, 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 scratch. He thinks to himself, uh-oh, as a set of legs enters. John screams, just look what you've done to my chair. You should be more considerate of other people's property. Now I know it's natural for cats to sharpen their claws. Fish gotta swim. Birds gotta fly. Cats gotta claw. But do it outside, okay, Garfield? John looks down. Garfield is now scratching John's leg as John screams, Garfield! Garfield is in a room. He is near a pair of feet. Garfield is asleep. Garfield yawns. He looks at the feet and says, what a heck of a way to wake up. Garfield is in a room running quickly past John Arbuckle. John looks down, looks ahead, looks up, looks to the left. Garfield runs by. John says, I know cats are fast, but that's ridiculous. Garfield is in a room with Odie and Lyman. Lyman screams, John, come quick. Look, Garfield is actually playing with Odie, and they are playing. John says, I know, it's because I sprayed Odie with something. Lyman says, with what? John says, with essence of lasagna. Garfield is in his cat bed. He has his sheets up, and he's thinking to himself, maybe there's more to life than just eating and sleeping. Maybe I should be more considerate of other people's feelings, nicer to Odie, and more generous. Garfield smiles. He goes back into his sheets and thinks to himself, nah. Garfield is in a room. He is laying down, thinking to himself, scratching posts, balls of yarn, and rubber mousies are okay, but when it comes to really neat playthings, give me a Christmas tree, as he goes up to the Christmas tree and starts knocking the balls off the decorations. The decorations are knocked off of the tree. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John says, what would you like for Christmas, Garfield? Garfield thinks to himself, 100 slave dogs. John says, I'll bet you'd like a nice fluffy ball of yarn to play with. Garfield thinks to himself, I think I'll put a piranha in his Christmas stocking. Garfield is in a room. He is looking outside. Santa Claus is flying outside. The silhouette of Santa is going by the moon. Ho, ho, ho. Santa Claus is now at John Arbuckle's chimney. Ho, ho, ho. He lands with a whoomp. He lands and looks around and thinks, let's see. Gifts for John, Lyman, and Odie. He reaches in. He starts to put gifts under the tree. Garfield sneaks up behind Santa. Oh, yes. And Garfield. How could I ever forget Garfield? Only kid in the world to ask for 20 pounds of lasagna. As Santa goes up the chimney. Garfield is in a room. He thinks to himself, this is my very first Christmas. I hope you have a loved one to spend today with, because I do. It's you. Merry Christmas. Garfield is in a room. John is throwing a ball as Garfield looks towards us. John says, okay, Garfield, go fetch. Garfield whistles and Odie runs by. Garfield is in a room. He is laying and sleeping on top of John Arbuckle. John is about to go to sleep. Or no, pardon me. John says, time to get up, Garfield. Garfield gurrs angrily. John thinks to himself, now what do I do, as Garfield goes back to sleep. Garfield is in a room. Odie is sitting at the edge of a table. Garfield pushes Odie off of the table. Clunk. Garfield thinks to himself, I'm not known for my compassion. Garfield is in a room. He is laying in his bed and thinks to himself, I love Fridays. The end of a long work week, the beginning of a weekend filled with relaxation, TV, sports, and parties. Almost makes me wish I had a job, as Garfield goes back to sleep. Garfield is in a room. He is wearing a hat, a party hat. It is quite large. Garfield thinks to himself, this year I resolve to be nicer to dogs. Odie jumps by. Maybe I'll cut down on lasagna instead, Garfield thinks to himself. Garfield is in a room. John Arbuckle. It is a party room. It is a room that is There's a room that has balloons and streamers behind him. John is drinking a drink. John looks towards Garfield and says, "It's time to make a New Year's resolution, Garfield." Garfield thinks to himself, "I resolved to lose weight and to start exercising this year." Garfield looks shocked, thinks to himself, "What am I saying? I must be going wacka wacka. I'm not going to die. I'm not going to exercise. I'm fat and I'm lazy and I'm proud of it." John goes up to Lyman and says, "Where's Garfield?" Lyman says, "He ate the buffet and went to bed." Garfield is in a room. He cracks open what appears to be a bottle of champagne. Pow, boom, he's drinking it. Now he drank it so quickly that it's coming out of his ears. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John says, "What would you like for breakfast, Garfield?" Garfield says, "A cup of coffee, a Danish, and the newspaper." Garfield looks as John grabs a bowl and says, "Have a warm bowl of milk." Garfield thinks to himself, "You people don't give us cats any credit." Garfield is in a room. He is in front of that bowl, thinking to himself, "Do you know why I don't like warm milk? Try this. Drink a bowl of warm milk, then never brush your teeth again." Garfield is in a room. Garfield thinks to himself, "Why is it all of us cats are stereotyped? All cats love milk, hate dogs, love mice, etc., etc. Sometimes I get so mad I could just kick my Gucci scratching post." Garfield is in a room. He is sitting on John's lap. John asks, "Do you know why you need me, Garfield?" I can sum it up in 2 words. Quality companionship. Garfield thinks to himself, body heat. Garfield is in a room. He is sitting on his chair. Garfield thinks to himself, "We cats are very independent. We need nobody, no time, nowhere, no way." Isn't that right, Pookie? Garfield pulls Pookie out. Garfield is in a room. He's walking by. There is a cupcake or a muffin, I don't know which, that has a string attached to it. Garfield walks by it going, "What ho? Oh, goody, a blueberry muffin." It is pulled away. John is sitting on top of the chair, dangling the muffin in front of Garfield. Garfield scratches. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He kicks the table leg. Crash. John Arbuckle is on the ground. All you see is his hand holding the string as Garfield is eating the muffin, thinking to himself, if you'll pardon the expression, there's more than one way to skin a cat. Garfield is in a room. John is holding what appears to be Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John Arbuckle is holding a shirt. John says, "Look what my mother made for you, Garfield. There, how's that?" And Garfield thinks to himself, it's nice and warm. As John puts the shirt on Garfield, Garfield continues to think to himself, disgusting, demeaning, itchy, and an abomination, but nice and warm. Garfield is in a room wearing the sweater, thinking to himself, would you just look at this? John's making me wear a kitty sweater. The sweater is very reminiscent of Charlie Brown. Garfield is in a room. He is wearing a sweater and thinking to himself, would you just look at this? John's making me wear a kitty sweater. People dress their pets up because it makes them look like little people. Well, I'm not a little person. I'm a cat. Garfield then proceeds to go up to a cup and thinks, for instance, I like a pinch of catnip in my morning cup of coffee. Garfield is not in a room. It is John and Lyman. John says, here he comes, say something nice. Garfield walks by wearing his sweater. Lyman says, looking good, Garfield. John says, sharp sweater, old buddy. Sad. Looks like a meatball in traction, John says. Garfield is in a room. He is wearing the sweater and thinking to himself, I was feeling pretty punk about having to wear this sweater until I saw Odie's new outfit. Odie is wearing a pimp suit and looking unimpressed. Garfield is not in a room. It is John Arbuckle. John Arbuckle notices that it's starting to rain. Uh-oh, it's starting to rain, he thinks. He thinks to himself, I better let Garfield in before his new sweater gets wet. Too late. The sweater is shrunk. The sweater is shrunk. Garfield is strangled as he's coming in. Garfield is in a room with Odie. Garfield thinks Garfield looks at Odie. Snicker, snicker. As Odie snickers. Odie starts to laugh. Harf, harf, harf. Garfield shoves the sweater in Odie's mouth. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John looks towards the reader and says, "When you own a cat, its hairs get everywhere." Garfield is smiling. "Every time I eat, I find a cat hair in my food. Let me show you. There is a food. It is his potatoes, peas, and what appears to be a biscuit. I know it's somewhere here." John Arbuckle is looking as Garfield is looking too. John keeps looking, screams, I can't eat till I find that hair." Garfield thinks to himself, "Silly me, I forgot to put it in there." Garfield is not in a room. He is outside chasing the mailman. Garfield is walking now towards the house as John Arbuckle is sitting on the front step. John says, "Garfield, you shouldn't chase the mailman like that." "No, now what would you do if you actually caught him?" Garfield thinks to himself. "I'd eat him." Garfield is in a room with John. John looks over at Garfield. "Garfield, you know cats can't drink." As Garfield is trying to reach for a cup of coffee. Garfield grabs it and drinks it. Slurp. John finishes his sentence. Coffee. Garfield thinks to himself, "Fill her up." And John says, "Well, I'll be dipped." Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John is sitting on his favorite chair. Garfield walks up, puts his arm on the chair. John then proceeds to move onto his little footstool as Garfield is now sitting on the chair. Garfield thinks, smiling. John says, "It's amazing how we've grown to understand one another." Garfield is in a room. There's a mouse behind Garfield. John is sitting in his chair as John screams, "Look, Garfield, a mouse." Garfield screams, "Eek." Garfield is scared, hiding behind John's head. Garfield is not in a room. John Arbuckle is outside, running, thinking to himself, "Bachelorhood is okay, I guess, but you just can't beat someone for you when you get home." Garfield hops towards John. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle and Odie. "Bark, bark." John is sitting on his chair. Odie is barking, and Garfield is scratching at Odie. They fight. John says, "And they say pets are therapeutic." Garfield is in a room with Odie. Odie is scratching. Scratch, 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 scratch. A flea lands on Garfield. Garfield thinks to himself, "Uh-oh, fleas." He runs. He grasps. He finds whatever he can. He grabs a bottle of alcohol from the kitchen or from the bathroom cabinet. Alcohol should do the trick, he thinks. Much better. John Arbuckle is smoking his pipe. He lights a match and throws it behind him. Whoof. Foomp. There's something to be said for flea collars, Garfield thinks, as he has been burnt. Garfield is in a room with John Arbuckle. John says, "Garfield, you sleep too much, you eat too much, and you watch too much television." Garfield thinks to himself, "What does John expect of me anyway? I'm only human." As Garfield walks towards the end, the sunset. Thank you.